Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to another episode of the Historians Lounge here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us back on the show is fellow historian and content creator Jessica Faulkner, where we dive into the forgotten histories of two of England's most prominent figures of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII and Mary I. And without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our returning guest back on the show, Wandering Scribe alumni, Jessica Faulkner. Jessica, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back, Gabriel. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Jessica, before we dive into our discussion on Henry VIII and Mary I, as sort of like a little, what's the word I'm thinking of? Reintroduction of the Tudors, because we did mention this in your historian's interview. Can you just share us again from your own experiences why people of like the modern age are so captivated by the Tudors out of all the royal families that had existed and occupied the English throne? Why do the Tudors still hold such sway?
I think the Tudors still for us are very juicy. Everything about them is scandalous and shocking, and that also doesn't feel that they are so far away as well. Obviously it was 500 years ago, but I think they feel in a closer touch distance with us. We've got portraits, we've got them in excellent detail, we've got this incredible detail about their inner lives and their thoughts and what they looked like and who they got along with. And I think this kind of what tantalizes them so much. And I think that's why they intrigue us so much, because you almost can't believe that there's a king of England who had 6 wives, executed 2 of them, and we can't stop talking about it because it's still so shocking today that someone did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ramifications that came with it, not just for England, but for his own family, for his daughters as well, who is also going to be in the discussion, Mary the First. So let's dive into our first question, shall we? So this first question is on Henry's marriages and the cultural influences of both. Now, from your own research and from your own understanding, Jessica, how did the tumultuous love life of Henry VIII shape the Renaissance perspective on romance and marriage in England? And were there any regional variations in how society responded to his many unions? Because, as you mentioned earlier, the Tudors are very scandalous, they're very juicy. I mean, this was a king who had 6 wives, executed 2 of them, imprisoned some of them, and in some cases loved the remainder. So, can you tell us your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so it's a great question to start off with. I think the main thing to know about Henry is that in his mind, he is a romantic, and he has this real perception that he is the romantic man. He's chivalrous, he woos the woman and then captures her. And you really see this with Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. It's all about, I'll give them a gift and I'll catch them, but I won't pressure them. And that's how he sees it. Whereas today we would go, well, no, you kind of didn't leave Anne Boleyn alone, so that isn't very romantic. But I think there's a big thing in the medieval period about courtly love, and it's kind of, banter, but you don't go past the edges of flirtation. And Henry in his reign really embodied this. Like, he's called Sir Loyalheart. He has on his jousting armor entwined K and H's, which you can see at the Tower of London. He's a very romantic person in his mind. But I think he does shape the perspective on romance and marriage in England once he starts to seek a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, because he's kind of allowing other people to think, well, I'm not happy in my marriage. Do I have to stay in it? And you do see this real shift of, well, I don't like her or I don't like him, so I am going to try and divorce them because the king can do it. And I think as well, his union with Anne Boleyn was so shocking for so many people. They didn't think he would actually do it. And when he then executes her literally 3 years later, people are appalled. They're like, that was your wife. You know, you've shared a bed with her, you've got a daughter with her. Is that really how you treat your wives? And it does become a bit of a running gag by Anne of Cleves that, well, you know, one wife died of heartbreak, you killed another, one died in childbirth. Who would want to marry you? And he does kind of become a joke in the marriage market because would you really want to sign over your daughter or sister to him, knowing what he's done to his other wives?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it does kind of break the whole standard of marriage at that time because most of England, and or I should say most of England at the time before the creation of the Church of England, and of course Europe, you know, marriage was very sacred. But we know that a lot of kings and queens had their consorts, their mistresses, but it was very different, at least from my understanding, with Henry VIII, of actively saying, "No, I'm divorcing my wife. I don't care what anyone says or talks about, and I'm going to make my own church," and really kind of lay the groundwork for, some could argue the modern perception of marriage that you can divorce from your partner. Granted, we've definitely come a long way from executing down the road. So that's a huge, huge upgrade from that. But it definitely does, really make us think of how things could have been greatly different had Henry stayed loyal to either Catherine of Aragon, or if he had chosen to create the Church of England and still married Anne Boleyn and did not execute her, it would have been entirely different. So it's just really, really fascinating on that. And you're absolutely right. Marriage was the courtly thing. It was the stories we see. And I'm probably jumping in history a little bit with you know Romeo and Juliet. That's probably the most iconic romance story of the Renaissance period. It is just very, very fascinating how, in a way, Henry VIII and the creation of the Church of England just said, "Nope, I'm making my own thing. I am separating from that." But I also wonder, before I get to the next question, how the rest of Protestant Europe viewed that as well. Have you ever come across that in your own research of how other Protestant kingdoms viewed the Church of England in regards to marriage and, courtly love or courtly marriages?
I think a lot of people viewed Henry and the Church of England as, well, this really is a Catholic church. It's just got the king's name at the top of it now. And I think that's a really important thing to remember about the Reformation is Henry was never Protestant. He was never Reformed. He was a Catholic until he died. He literally just left his allegiance with the Pope because it didn't suit him to have this alliance if he's not going to be granted his divorce. And again, it's another thing to remember about Henry is he doesn't like being told no.
Yeah,
And he will find a way to get his own way because let's face it, he was quite a spoiled man.
he
But
was.
you're gonna be, you get brought up as a prince and then you're a future king of England, you are going to be a bit spoiled. But I think people did view Henry as a bit of a joke as time got on. I think people in England were terrified of him. I think his courtiers were terrified. But I think like Francis I, and we also know Martin Luther, who started pretty much the Reformation. He really kicked it into gear. Thinks Henry's a joke. He hates Henry VIII. He writes pamphlets about him and he calls him horrible names, and then you've got Henry VIII shouting back at him. I think Henry, to a European standard, didn't get on well because he just looked like a spoilt child who couldn't accept when he was told no.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this actually kind of leads into the next question, which is on, the religious reforms and the gender dynamics of England during this time. Now, let's imagine, let's say, had Mary the First been born a king instead of a queen, how might Protestantism have evolved differently during Henry VIII's time? Because we know Queen Mary, she does try to bring back Catholicism. She does try to bring it back. But I'm very curious, had she been born a king, would that drive have been more prominent? Or would, for this case, let's say Martin, in the case of if Mary was born Martin, if Martin was king, would Martin have more kind of stayed in line with what their father wanted? And would have Protestantism taken on a different turn?
I think it's quite hard because I think if we imagine Mary as a man, I think she would have had more tutelage under Henry. I think Catherine of Aragon had a very heavy involvement in Mary's education, so I think that's what influences Mary. But I think if Mary was, as you say, a boy, her education would have been a different level. But I think it's quite hard to say whether she would have carried on with what her father decreed, because if she was a boy, we never would have had the divorce. There would never have been a divorce. I think, personally, if Mary would have stayed Catholic even if she was a man. And I think if Mary was a man, the actions that she did in her reign, we would hail, well, she had to do it, She had so many heretics. But because she's a woman, we don't allow her that kindness that we maybe afford Henry when the pilgrimage of grace happened and he killed thousands and in quite a horrific way. We go, oh, well, he needs to do that. They rose against him. We don't see that with Mary. And I think if Mary was a man, we might have said she was one of our best kings of England. I think it's as simple as that. It's because she is a woman and she did things that a king would do. We don't seem to like that.
Absolutely. So, almost kind of like to reiterate, had Mary been born a man, Protestantism probably would not have been the dominant religion of England. You probably still would have Catholicism deeply ingrained in English society. As you said, that she would have had a more powerful tutelage under their father, under Henry. And the crimes, I won't say the crimes, but the actions that Mary took in our timeline, had Mary been born a boy and the actions still took place, the reactions and the remembrance would be quite different, as you said, because, we don't give Mary that kind of reprieve. We don't give her that kind of grace for doing what she needs to do. We kind of put too much pressure on her. But had she been born a boy, as you said, we would have regarded Mary as like the greatest king that England has ever known. And you probably wouldn't even have Elizabeth. You would have no the Virgin Queen story. You probably would not have the Spanish Armada conflict. In fact, the whole foundation of England would be greatly changed. You probably wouldn't even have, I dare say, had Mary been born a boy, you probably wouldn't even have the, what's the word I'm thinking of? The English Civil War. You probably wouldn't have the English Civil War. Or I wouldn't go that far. I think the English Civil War may still would have happened, but it probably would have taken on a different shape. You wouldn't have the issues with Catholicism and Protestantism. You probably would have still had an issue with, the kings and parliament, but it would have been the undertone of religion, I think. But that's another discussion entirely.
Yes, it is. I think as you say, I think things in history would have still happened, but how intense would it have been? I mean, I think the Reformation probably would have happened because it was spreading all over Europe, but would it have come to the extent it did if Henry wasn't seeking a divorce?
Yes, absolutely, very true. Now let's talk into the patronage and also gender roles. And I want us to look into the contrasting approaches of Henry VIII and Mary I when it comes to patronage. And what do these differences reveal about, the roles of men and women in leadership during the Tudor era? Well, we know we can look at an example of Mary I and, of course, her sister, Queen Elizabeth. But I'm very curious from your own experience, Jessica, because I know very little of this aspect of the monarchy, of the differences of patronage to, Henry VIII and his daughter, Mary I.
So, always to be a successful monarch, you shouldn't really have favourites because it doesn't go very well, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll have other nobles come up against you, like Edward II when he had Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, two of his favourites. They ended both so badly for him, and he did lose his throne. But going back to Henry, we actually see Henry really enjoys a man who hasn't who has noble origins. He's humble origins, sorry. So Thomas Cromwell was a
Yep.
butcher. Well, his dad was a butcher. No, he wasn't. Sorry, I'll say that again. Completely lost my train of thought. So Henry really favoured people from humble origins. So Wolsey, his father was a butcher, and Thomas Cromwell, his dad was a blacksmith. And I think Thomas More also came from relatively humble origins, but again, they were all learned men. But what Henry enjoyed is that he can go, well, I've risen you this high, I can take you back this low. And you really do see that Anne Boleyn, she's not a commoner, but he rises her up and he's got the power to destroy her. And I think Mary is very much more careful in having too many favourites. So we can see that she clearly favours Spanish because it is connected to her mother's homeland and they are her family, and you see her favour them more. But you also see that it is politic for her to also get on with all the nobles in England because she is a woman, so they view her differently. And I think it's quite interesting to see the contrast in both of them, where Mary is kind of more tactical and Henry will be close with people that he likes, and he only wants people that he likes surrounded with him, whereas Mary was a lot more pragmatic and a lot more strategic in that sense.
Absolutely. So it is very different when you look at it. As you mentioned, Henry came from a very humble origins. Most people in his court came from humble origins. And in a way, I remember one person saying this in like a documentary where one person said and compared Henry VIII almost to like a, lack of better words, a mafia don, where he could rise you up, but if you cross him or you don't do what he says, he could easily destroy you if he wanted to. Mary, on the other hand, as you mentioned, is more practical, more pragmatic. Yes, she does have, close ties to the Spanish crown because of her mother, but she's also realizing she can't show too much favoritism to the Spanish crown because she's not a Spanish queen. She's an English queen. So she has to balance those relations. And she has to be very careful of, who she trusts because there are probably, and there probably were, a lot of people in her court that wanted her out of power very, very quickly and very, very easily, as we know in our own history. So it is very interesting, the whole patronage, because we see that in, other kings throughout European history where they have favorites, or they have families that are, loyal to them because of either brotherhood or by common cause, common blood. But sometimes that always doesn't go the right way, as we have seen in numerous accounts over the years.
Yeah, I think a really good example of it as well is Edward IV, who is Henry VIII's granddad or grandfather. And he marries Elizabeth Woodville, who she's a commoner and no one really knows her family. And when they do marry, he really rises up the Woodville family, the Rivers, everyone associated with Elizabeth Woodville. And this alienates him completely because people like the old nobles, like the Nevilles, Henry the Percys, is kind of like, we're old stock, we are blue blood nobility. How can you not do this? And Henry does sometimes go in that path with like Anne Boleyn. He really rises up the Boleyns. It's the Boleyn faction, and everyone then hates the Boleyns because they've got the king's ear, they've got too much power. And then it happens kind of again with the Seymours as well, but to a lesser extent. Once Jane dies, I mean, they are still at court, especially Edward Seymour still like exerts this a mass of influence, but he doesn't really get to exert as much of it until Henry dies, because he goes, I am the protector of England, I am the king's uncle. It doesn't work for the Seymours as well as it did for the Boleyns did, because Henry is a lot more cautious after the Boleyns and the downfall of Anne. Well, I can't be too close to a particular family because look where it's got me.
Right. Absolutely very true. And that kind of leads also into the power of propaganda, where we know propaganda is a huge tool used not just by Henry and Mary, but by all kings and queens in history. And I wonder if we can also explore the propaganda tactics used by Henry to justify his annulment and compare them to Mary's efforts to secure her legitimacy to the throne. And in those two instances of propaganda, how did messaging shape their reigns? I think we already kind of touched on Henry's a little bit earlier about, him trying to separate from his wife and establish the Church of England. But I wonder if we can explore Mary's first and how she used propaganda to, justify her legitimacy, because by face value, she is legitimate. She is a legitimate heir to the throne by the rightful laws of, the church and by the governing body. It would have been a no-brainer. But unfortunately, that was not the case initially.
No, exactly. And a really important thing to note about Mary is even when Henry is saying to everyone, well, no, my marriage to her mother was not legitimate, she's not legitimate, people were like, she is. The Pope signed dispensations to make sure there was nothing to impede your marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So Mary was always viewed as legitimate, whereas we see with Elizabeth, people still give her that stain of illegitimacy because of Anne Boleyn. And when Edward dies, so Mary's younger brother, he changes his will, and it's this big thing of he cuts out Mary and Elizabeth, and it goes straight to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey. When Mary discovers this, she's immediately setting up a claim to the throne, and she literally, while she's doing this, she's going, I am the true heir. You remember my sainted mother, Catherine of Aragon. I can bring us back to the old ways of the Catholic Church. She really played on the image of, but I am the true only child of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. I am the true heir. And she really plays on this. And she also plays on it for the rest of her reign, because she hasn't just got English royal blood in her, she's got Spanish royal blood in her as well.
Right.
So this really does play in her advantage. And I think when she's kind of changing the religion, she's able to spin it in a very positive away, because she's like, well, do you not remember how great it was? Like this was one of the best times of our life. And I think Mary was very good at, especially, I am the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. My grandmother was Isabella of Castile, the
Yes.
warrior queen. You want me as your queen. And she does kind of learn these propaganda techniques off Henry. We can't forget that Mary will have learned a lot off her father, whether he did it on purpose or inadvertently, we don't know. But Mary was very good at creating a good image and a right image that, it didn't matter if people did think she was illegitimate, because she wasn't. She knew she wasn't, because she had that belief, and she was kind of able to spin that. And whereas Henry kind of was like, well, I was never married to Catherine of Aragon, and he kind of just spins this narrative of propaganda of, well, she was married to my brother, they definitely must have slept together. And it's kind of, that's what his divorce was, really. It was a massive propaganda and smear campaign against Catherine of Aragon. It was huge. So I think Mary learned a lot from Henry to shift the narrative, and Mary was the right one to be on the throne ultimately. And it doesn't mean Lady Jane Grey or Queen Jane deserved her fate, but Mary was very good at spinning that I am the legitimate heir. I will bring back England to the comforts of Rome, and all our souls will be safe. And she genuinely believed that. She genuinely believed that if they reunited back with the Pope, that everyone in England would be safe.
Absolutely. And again, going to the show The Spanish Princess, which may or may not be entirely accurate to the actual history. What I think is, comparative throughout history and the show, everybody loved Catherine of Aragon. Everybody adored her. She really brought England back from the brink. At least that's what the show wants us to believe. And when, as you mentioned, when Henry started putting the smear campaign on Catherine, you have to imagine, probably everyone probably didn't know exactly what was being spoken to or the papers at the time. Everybody knew that she was a great queen. She was a queen that had brought England back, put it on the forefront, because if you really look at England's place at that time, and correct if I'm wrong, Jessica, England, while it was powerful, it was not the most powerful kingdom in European history. A lot of times people viewed the Spanish as the dominant kingdom in all of Europe because of not just its close ties to the church, to Rome, but because of its naval power. I mean, the Spanish Armada was the most dominant naval fighting force in all of European history. It was probably the most powerful kingdom, probably next to the Kingdom of France in terms of political power, religious power, and more. England was not as powerful. It was a very strong kingdom, but not in the sense of a world power as it was during that time, correct?
No, you're absolutely correct. So the Spanish Empire was called the Holy Roman Empire, because of Charles V. He inherits this title from his grandfather on his dad's side, and it's just, they have the political power, they are wealthier than us, they are close with the Pope, the naval, the art, you name it, they were so powerful. And England was nothing in comparison. We did have a good navy, and Henry VIII was very good at bolstering our naval ships, but to compare to the Holy Roman Empire, we really were nothing. And I think this is kind of why people were so shocked, because if you went against Catherine of Aragon and kind of insinuated that she was not truthful about her marriage with Arthur, you're possibly bringing down the might of the Holy Roman Empire, who would invade England. And that was a real risk. So Mary, again, was like, because of my close blood ties with this country, they're never going to invade us, because why would they hurt their kin? So she was able to really spin it to her benefit.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into also marriage politics during the Tudor era and its connection to foreign relations. So, if we look at, Henry VIII's marital strategies, which may have influenced Mary the First's foreign policy, especially regarding her controversial marriage to Philip II of Spain, from what we can gather, what were the stakes at this time?
So for Mary, she thought it was really important to have a good political and working relationship with the Spanish. And the Spanish ambassador at the time, Simon Renard, kind of really pushed forward that, you should marry a Spanish prince. This is what your mother would want. And I mean, people didn't want it. They were so scared that they were going to take over England. So Mary did kind of have to assure people that, no, I am the Queen of England. He is going to be my consort. And she really heavily implied, he is my consort. Philip will be my consort. He is not going to be a king of England in such a way where he has more say than me. But for Mary, by the time it's kind of her time to be queen, England was very politically isolated because Henry isolated England so much. That's why he marries Anne of Cleves, is because Spain and France don't want to align with him again. So he has to look elsewhere. So for Mary, she thinks this is really great foreign diplomacy, because surely that's two birds with one stone. She's got so much resources now at her hand, and it's going to bolster England's political strength again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it also brings in trade, it brings in economic growth. But as you mentioned before, it does bring into the fears of, had, Mary did take on Philip not as a consort, but as a king, it would have greatly changed, the landscape of England, because England would not be an independent kingdom. It would have been part of the Holy Roman Empire. You probably would have had a lot more Spanish influence in England, more, would have greatly shaped, the language, the history, the culture, and all of that. So it is very, very fascinating. And with everything we talked about so far, Jessica, that actually perfectly now segues into the aspect of literature and the royal legacy. And as we've talked about in your historian's interview, the Tudors are a very juicy family for writers to really explore and to divulge in. Henry VIII has had so many adaptations over the years in modern cinema. His wives have had their own due process, films, songs, books, and more. And I'm wondering, can we pinpoint any specific themes and narratives in literature, whether modern or in the past, that were sparked by their reigns?
So, as you say, there's so much that sparks Henry VIII on TV and in books and films. I think a lot of his reign, we pinpoint it as the Six Wives of Henry VIII, and this is kind of the narrative that we've stayed with. We don't focus on any of his military exploits. We don't explore the Battle of Flodden. We don't explore the sinking of the Mary Rose. We don't really explore his relationships with Thomas Cromwell or Wolsey or Bishop Moore. We do really focus on the Six Wives, and we have literally we have Shakespeare's play, and it focuses not really on the six wives. I would say I mean, it's been a long time since I've read William's Henry VIII, but Anne Boleyn's like barely in it, and maybe we do need to start doing different narratives when it comes to Henry VIII, because there is more to him than the six wives, annoyingly, I hate to say. But I think what inspires Mary's TV shows is a lot of how people at the time or after her death felt about her. So the only reason why she's called Bloody Mary is because it's an Elizabethan propaganda. It's to make her reign look terrible.
Right.
And we have focused on that. We've kind of stayed with that. So whenever she's in something, it's look at how obsessive she's getting over killing people. Look how tragic a figure she is because she's obsessed with her husband, Philip. How we look at her tragic childhood and look, it shapes her into this monster. I think we only focus on certain points and it stays kind of that same way throughout history. Like with the six wives, it's, at first it's kind of like, well, look at Anne Boleyn, she's a adulteress and she's a whore, and it's the same with Catherine Howard. And then we get the Victorian author Agnes Strickland, who writes one of like the first biographies on the six wives, and she puts Victorian ideals onto them and kind of changes the narrative of them in literature. And I think this really kind of adapts, and you see it again in the 20th century with Anne of the Thousand Days, where it's a much more sympathetic and nuanced view of Anne Boleyn. She's not perfect, but she's also no monster either. And I think it kind of trickles down through history where it's, well, we have the facts, and you see what people take from these people over the years. We have taken that he had six wives, and that's all we focus on. Mary, she gets too obsessive with burning Protestants. Elizabeth I is the Golden Queen, and that's kind of the narrative that is still sticking with us today, I would say.
Right. Absolutely. And I definitely think, that's not all these people are. There's more. And as you talk about the military campaigns of Henry, no one seems to talk about how, his reign also changed that of sometimes a little bit of Scotland, a little bit of Ireland. In fact, I was doing my own research on the Tudor invasions of Ireland during that time and how they greatly reshaped the country of Ireland and the fall of the Gallowglass warrior class of Ireland, who were of Scottish descent with a little bit of Viking heritage. It is very, very fascinating. But again, as you say, we only tend to focus on the six wives of Henry VIII. We do not look at him as a warrior king during his time. We only focus on the political scandal of his marriage life because that is juicy gossip. That is, the Reader's Digest, the People's Magazine of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not to say Henry VIII was a very successful military king and leader, but I still think it's a very important bit of his life that we don't really value. I think we don't focus on him enough in his early life. We tend to go from the 1520s onwards. We don't focus when he becomes king because it isn't juicy enough. Basically, that's kind of what it is. It's not juicy enough. We don't focus on his what seems like a love match with Catherine of Aragon when they get married. They are called the golden couple because of how incredible and how in love they are. And look, she's pregnant pretty much after they get married. We don't focus on that, and we don't really focus on Henry as a father. Well, I'm not saying he was a good father. He was a bit neglectful towards his daughters, but we only tend to focus on Henry and the six wives, and I think we need to start exploring more of Henry's other aspects of life as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now let's talk about something that you don't really hear as much in history, and that is monarchy and health problems. Now, from your own research, Jessica, what insights can we gain about the perceptions of monarchy and the divine right by, examining the health struggles of Henry VIII and Mary the First during their respective reigns? Because we know for Henry VIII, I mean, the iconic pictures that we have of him in his later years, he's a very big man. He's a very large man. And his armor had to, grow with him for him to fit because he couldn't fit in his normal armor. And that's how, going to a media representation, when we look at Game of Thrones, Robert Baratheon. Robert Baratheon, in his youth, was a very strong, lean, very stocky fighter. But as he got older, his armor had to be changed. His armor had to suit his size, which a lot of people argue that was a nod and a reference to Henry VIII.
So we see a lot of, in later life, Henry has real health struggles. You know, he's got a old jousting wound from his earlier years that reopens in 1536. I think that's the year it starts to become worse, and we kind of see him struggle more with eyesight. You know, he puts on weight very quickly because he can't be as physically active as he once was. And I think it's really important to remember that monarchs believed that God had appointed them to this role. You know, they were chosen to do this. And you see Henry go a lot, I have been chosen to do this. I am the rightful king, I am God's worthy successor kind of situation. And you kind of see his health struggles a lot. And I mean, you can't help but pity him because, you know, there was no painkillers back then, really.
Right.
I mean, he would have loved paracetamol, I reckon. I think it might have made him a little bit less crabby in his later years. But we also see Mary struggle a lot with health issues. I mean, we possibly believe she died of ovarian cancer. We see her health struggles really begin once the divorce happens, and a lot of people say, well, it must be stress because she's witnessing this between her parents. And I think it's a little bit of a combination. I think we know that she had painful periods. We know she suffered with headaches a lot in her early years, and they plague her until she's dying. So I think the health problems we see these people, monarchs, have makes them again a little bit more real because, I mean, if you're a woman and you have a bad period, you can relate to that. I think if they were ill, they would go, well, clearly God is trying to test me and my strength and endurance to him. So I think they won't go, well, you know, this is personal. They go, well, we're not meant to have an easy life. You know, God sends these things to try us. And I think that's both what Mary and Henry would have thought is, you know, God is just doing this to test me. And they wouldn't have seen it as an illness that has happened because of a reason.
Mm, absolutely. Very, very true. The divine right of kings, which has been the prominent thing in all monarchs throughout history, that they have been appointed by right and represent, the physical embodiment of not just the church, but of the divine laws that govern all the kingdoms across Europe, which is very, very fascinating. And also, kind of adding a little tangent on, we also can't forget also Elizabeth's health issues during her reign as well. And correct if I'm wrong, Jessica, but Elizabeth's health issues were in relations to her makeup, correct? Of that was a contributing factor of the amount of makeup that the chemicals that were in her makeup to make her very pale contributed to her illness, correct?
Yes. So Elizabeth in 1562 nearly died of smallpox. It was a deadly disease, and you were very lucky to survive it. Elizabeth did, thankfully, but she was left with scarring all over her face. So she would use white makeup, which was infused with lead, which is so dangerous. And effectively, she did get poisoning from it, I think, because she was using it for what, 40 years before she died. And it's kind of, she'd have seen that God has chosen to keep her alive, but look at all the damage that she ended up doing to her skin because she is having to cover it up to create this image again of propaganda that, you know, she is the Virgin Queen, look how flawless she is. So I think it's really interesting to see how historical figures tackle illnesses, because we would probably have a very different approach today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, let's talk about probably the big thing, which is the economic challenges Henry VIII and Mary experienced. And I'm actually wondering, in your opinion, during Henry VIII's reign and his own struggles with financial decisions for the security of England, did that also play in a way to Mary's hardships with the economy during her rule as well? And ultimately, what legacy did he leave behind, not just for his children, but also for the country at that time?
So when Henry became king in 1509, he inherited a very wealthy kingdom. His father, Henry VII, left a very full treasury, and I mean, he left a lot of money in the treasury for his son when he inherited. And pretty much maybe a year or 2 years later, Henry VIII pretty much spent all of it. You know, by the time Henry dies, England is in a dire position financially because Henry VIII cannot manage his finances at all. He leaves Edward such a poor kingdom that is, you almost kind of want to go, no, actually, I don't really want to be king because you've left me with nothing. So when Mary kind of comes to the throne, she takes a lot of steps to bolster the treasury again, bolster the navy back up again, because of how dire the financial situation was. So I think Henry didn't, for his children, will not have left a very good legacy because they had a lot to sort out because of his decisions when it comes to money. And you can see when it's the dissolution of the monasteries, a lot of it is because of money, because of how wealthy these dioceses are. So it's really hard. And I think Mary needs to get more credit for how she really does bring back the finances up in England, because it can't have been an easy thing to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that kind of goes into the next question, which is public perceptions of gender in leadership. And if we compare, Mary's reign as a female ruler to that of her father as a male monarch, and we kind of already touched on this, but maybe we can go a little bit more using the previous question as a stepping point. How did gender shape the perceptions of authority and leadership styles? Because as we kind of been touching on in this discussion, we don't give Mary a lot of grace or breathing room. And kind of going forward from that, with the financial situation of England at the time, had she failed to bolster the treasury, she would never live it down. She would be forever known as the queen who failed England, the woman who could not save her country. That would have been the public perception of her and what history would have remembered her as. So, as I remember one historian that I follow who say, for people in power, especially for women, at that time, they did not have the luxury of losing. They had to be the best. They had to make sure everything went accordingly because one slip up could be a career ender.
Yes, exactly. I think a lot of the issues that Mary faces is that people go, she's a woman, she's not capable of ruling, and you see that kind of filter into Elizabeth's reign as well, as you know. So you see a lot of her courtiers in Elizabeth's reign go, I can't believe I've got to answer to the whims of a woman. And you see a lot of this kind of misogynistic attitude towards Mary and Elizabeth. And a lot of Mary's courtiers didn't think she was really up to the job because she was a woman. They thought, you know, you need to try and have a son because we can't have another queen. And Henry VIII does kind of get visioned as great because he's a male, he was a king, and again, we don't really give Mary that kindness because I think it's hard when you're the first official Queen of England. You're kind of the first standard, and no one really knew what to do with the situation they were given. And Mary had to really challenge these kind of views that people had on her. That, you know, she's a woman. She hasn't got the mettle to be a Queen of England and make all these important decisions. But when she did, she wasn't liked for it because that isn't womanly enough of her. So I think it was a real balancing act between, especially for Mary and then Elizabeth, of, well, you don't like it when I do make a decision. You don't think I'm being womanly enough or virtuous enough. You know, you want me to be sitting at home sewing and waiting for my husband. Or when you did do something that maybe sign an execution warrant, it was, oh my God, why would you do such a thing? You know, it was a real tipping point, and I think Mary, gets the worst of it because she's our first example of queenship.
Absolutely, which is interesting if you look at, the other queens in European history. Some of them who were in maybe not warrior queens or very strong-willed queens, they were in some cases beloved by their subject. They applauded them for taking the reins, for being very pragmatic. And yet it's a shame that Mary, again, is not given that grace. She's not given the opportunity to show herself. To use a movie quote, it's like giving Mary a fixed card deck and expecting her to play by the rules of the game and then calling her out. Well, why isn't she winning? Why isn't she succeeding? You gave her a fixed deck. You're expecting her to fail. And kind of going forward from that, it's again using another movie quote, uh, is almost in the sense of, is she only supposed to be Queen of England when the mood suits the court, when the mood suits the lords and in some cases the ladies of the English aristocracy, the old stock, the old guard. So it is very, very fascinating. And we're now reaching the final question, Jessica, of this incredible discussion of Henry VIII and Mary I. And I think this one is a very special one because I don't think I've ever seen any other historian talk about this. And that is, of course, the artistic influences and national identity. Now, as we know, Henry VIII and Mary I were very interested, very invested in art. The art of the time was prevalent throughout all of Europe. And I'm wondering, from their perceptions of art and their interest in art, I'm curious, from your own research, did that mirror in a way their visions for the English identity amidst, the backdrop of religious turmoil and political instability? And ultimately, through the arts, what messages or message were they trying to convey?
So Henry VIII was very good at projecting an image and what he wants you to take from that image. So the Whitehall mural that was done by Hans Holbein, you're meant to be intimidated by the way he is standing, how kingly he looks, you know, how he's staring at you. So Henry's very good at putting that image forward. And Mary's also very good at it as well. You see in her portraits where she's holding a rose and she's kind of standing up, and she's also got a hand on a chair. Or she's sitting down but holding a rose. And she's showing how regal she is. She is the Queen of England, and she's also very good when she marries Philip of getting joint commissions of coins, paintings, seals that have got both of them on it to show this unity of England and Spain. So she's very good at projecting that image of a unity, and Henry's very good at projecting an image of be scared of me because I am the King of England. And the Whitehall mural is intimidating in more than ways than one as well. And I think it's important to show that that is also another form of their propaganda, is they would manipulate their image to convey a message.
Absolutely. So almost kind of sense of for Henry VIII, from what you're telling me, is he wanted England, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, he wanted England to be feared by her enemies. He wanted England to be seen as this lion that had not had its claws dulled, that it was still a force to be reckoned with. Whereas Mary was more so trying to project an image, not totally to the other kingdoms of Europe, but more so of the people of England, saying that, we are united, we are strong, we are a force to be reckoned with, but we have this sense of unity in a sense, because that's ultimately what Mary's been trying to do during her reign. She wanted England to be stable. And before we finish off, this leads into another question, which I had my own thoughts on. I would like to hear your expertise on, Jessica. With everything we talked about on Mary the First, and what her father did, and how in a way he kind of laid the foundation, for lack of a better term, for Mary, and then on the offset, Elizabeth. Had Mary established a stronger relations with those in her court, and public relations and foreign relations outside and within England, do you think there may have been a possible chance? Because I remember seeing someone writing about this, that had Mary and possibly Elizabeth worked with each other, that England in that reality would have been greatly different. On one side, you have this older sister, Mary, who is a legitimate heir to the throne. And then you have her sister, Elizabeth, her younger sister, who may have her own ideas. How different do you think English history would have been had those two may not have been on opposite sides, but have actually worked together as sisters to build not just their family dynasty, the Tudors, but to work together to make England not in the image of their father, but to propel what they wanted an English identity to be?
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues of Mary's reign is that she goes quite extreme, or her policies are very extreme. I think maybe if Mary was a bit slower on that pace with religion, we may have a different view of her. And I think maybe if she did maintain a better relationship with Elizabeth, there would have been a better sign of unity between the Tudor family, because after all, they were the only two left of Henry's children, and they didn't have their mothers. So I think it would have displayed quite a big, strong sense of, look at these two Tudor siblings. She's queen. She's possibly queen to be. It would have changed things. I think, sadly though, the major thing for Mary is maybe she lets her husband and the Spanish ambassador influence her ever so slightly too much, and Pole and Gardner. I think if Mary was more nuanced as well, I think maybe her reign wouldn't be as hotly hated as it was. I think it's because she changes things so quickly people didn't like it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a huge thing when it comes to history. It's these numerous what ifs. And if you look in just the Tudor reign alone, there's a plethora of what ifs. What if Henry had not divorced Catherine of Aragon? What if possibly Catherine of Aragon also had a son in conjunction with Mary, not conjunction, but also gave birth to a son with Mary and Tow and having twins? How different would that have been? Or what if Henry was not the man we know him to be from the histories, from the ledgers, from the writings of the scholars of the time, or even back then? There are so many different possibilities you could explore. Or even a big one, what if Henry Tudor, Henry's father, died during the War of the Roses? You would not even have Mary. You would not even have Elizabeth. You would have just had is it the Yorkshire family? I always get messed up with the families.
So if Henry VII died and Richard III stayed king, it would have still been the Yorkist line. So it would have still been the Plantagenet line.
Yes, that is correct. That is the Plantagenets, which was probably the most prominent of all of the dynasties in English history, founded by, of course, Henry Plantagenet, who is the father of Richard and John, and all of those incredible, and not to mention, oh, why am I blanking on the name now? Why am I blanking on her name? The queen, for Henry.
Henry VII. Elizabeth of York.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. There we go. There we go. There are so many names that are so familiar that carry over. It's absolutely insane.
I know there's too many. There's too many names, and they're all the same. So it's really hard to differentiate them.
Absolutely, Jessica. Absolutely. So, as we wrap up this incredible discussion here on the Historians Lounge, ultimately, Jessica, from what we talked about, what do you hope people will take away from our re-examination of Henry VIII, and also more importantly, Mary the First?
I hope listeners maybe explore Henry's other bits of life. I think that, as I was saying earlier, we need to focus less on maybe on the six wives of Henry VIII and maybe focus on his military campaigns, his financial campaigns. Because obviously Henry VIII is not a likable figure. Like, he's, in today's standards, we're very shocked by his actions. And I think with Mary, again, as I said last time, we need to give her so much more kindness and maybe re-examine how we have treated her throughout history, because we let her father get away with most of the terrible things he's done. So why do we not give Mary that same credence? I hope people will take this away and go, do you know what? I really want to research Mary more and learn more about Mary the person, and not the Mary that we get peddled out from her reign.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Jessica. And I think at the end of the day, I think, a proper re-examination, a re-study of Mary is in order. And just not just her, but also the other queens and the other women in Henry VIII's lives, which is also, as we mentioned in your historian's interview, that is a project that you are working on, which I cannot wait to see. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude another episode here of the Historians Lounge on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to Jessica for coming back on the show and sharing with us her knowledge and expertise on the Tudors, and wishing her the very best with her show, with her content going forward. Now, Jessica, before we wrap up, are there any announcements you'd like to share with the viewers and listeners? Any upcoming episodes for your podcast? Any posts we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, on Instagram, please be on the lookout for the next episode of my Mistresses of Henry VIII. And on the podcast, please look out for the upcoming episode with renowned historian and writer Alison Weir, who I will be discussing her brand new book, The Boleyn Secret, with.
Nice. I'll link all that down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to know more about Jessica's background in Tudor history and why she decided to focus on Tudor history, I will also tag her historian's interview right up here for you to watch. And if you'd like to see her back on the show in a follow-up historian's interview, or possibly an historian's roundtable on English history or Tudor history, you know what you have to do. Like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Until then, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Happy Tuesday, everybody, and we'll see you all next time.